But if they want to try to annihilate Ontario, I will do everything, including cut off their energy, with a smile on my face. So, and I'm encouraging every other province to do the same. Quebec, Manitoba, BC, we all have to act in unison. Out east, they rely on our energy. They need to feel the pain.
Canada is threatening to cut off the United States energy supply in a swift and decisive manner after being hit by a new wave of tariffs. With President Donald Trump's administration came many economic tariffs that have sparked a trade war with Canada, China, and Mexico. But Canada is not taking things lying down and has replied with new tariffs and a threat that will change the U.S. energy sector. Don't miss out on our latest updates on the U.S. trade war and subscribe to our channel.
But very importantly, tomorrow tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start. So they're going to have a tariff. So what they have to do is build their car plants, frankly, and other things in the United States, in which case they have no tariffs.
Trump increases tariffs against Canada. The U.S. President Donald Trump has imposed 25% tariffs on many products entering the U.S. from Canada, which became effective overnight. But many businesses and economists are worried about this, saying that the added costs on import goods will have wide-ranging implications across the economy. Trump has moved forward with his plan to collect a 25% tariff on nearly all goods from Canada, and Canadian energy products will be levied at a lower rate of 10%. This has threatened a trade war with Canada, one of its closest trading partners.
That isn't the only thing that Donald Trump is talking about. He also has what I call the untariff, which is that he's saying that he may raise tariffs to 15%, but he's also going to say if you manufacture something here in the United States, he's going to lower the tax to 15%. So in other words, something made in, say, Dayton, Ohio or Charleston, South Carolina is going to cost less, but something coming in from China is going to cost more.
Due to this, many companies, including automakers and alcohol producers, have warned that these tariffs will affect import goods from Canada and implicate the American economy. Some companies are planning to source their goods from other countries, while others are considering moving production to the U.S., but this move could take years. Before this move could happen, companies will have to pay the 25% tariffs on all these goods, and either absorb the fee and cut costs elsewhere or take lower profits, or they will have to pass the added cost to the consumers, leading to higher prices. According to Trump, he's putting the tariffs in place to pressure Canada into stopping undocumented immigrants and fentanyl from entering the United States through their borders. Trump had previously threatened to place these tariffs on Canadian goods in February, but then Canadian leaders said they will be stepping up security at their borders. But suddenly, Trump told the media that there was no room left for Canada to negotiate on the new import duties. Automakers are expected to feel the greatest impact of America's newest tariffs because their vehicles and their components often cross between Canada, the US, and Mexico many times during the production process. Tariffs could add as much as $12,000 to the price of a new car.
And this is the quote that got a lot of attention in regards to a question about the impact or potential impact of tariffs if they were implemented. And he wrote, so far what we're seeing is a lot of cost and a lot of chaos. The chaos is because Ford, like GM and Stellantis, have a lot of exposure in terms of manufacturing in Mexico. And even though the 25% tariff that was initially announced with Mexico and Canada has been put on hold, Ford has got to make its contingency plans.
Tariffs will also affect the aluminum industry, as the U.S. sources 2/3 of the primary aluminum it uses every year from Canada and 90% of scrap metal from Canada and Mexico. These tariffs could also increase the prices of alcohol and beer imported from Canada. But Trump's move will eventually lead to a trade war, especially now that Canada is hitting back. Canada hits back. Canada has responded to the latest tariffs from the U.S. with retaliatory import taxes of its own, and this could be the start of another trade war. Canada has placed tariffs on tens of billions of dollars worth of products imported from the U.S., and it seems like they want to go even further. Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, has been anticipating these tariffs and has outlined retaliatory measures. Under these, a 25% tariff will be imposed on 155 billion Canadian dollars of American goods. The first stage will be on about 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods from U.S. exporters. Then, in 3 weeks, another tariff will be placed on 125 billion Canadian dollars of products. These will include major items like cars, trucks, steel, and aluminum. Trudeau has threatened that these measures will be kept in place until Trump withdraws its tariffs. Meanwhile, the Foreign Minister Melanie Joy told reporters that Trump's tariffs posed an existential threat to Canada because jobs were at risk. About 1 million jobs in Canada are at risk due to these tariffs, especially since there's intertwined trade between the two countries. This back and forth can disrupt one of the largest bilateral trade relationships in the world.
Another estimates the new tariffs could cost the average U.S. family more than $1,200 a year. But Trump says tariffs will push people to buy American, and he says there's a simple solution for countries that want to avoid tariffs.
What they have to do is build their car plants, frankly, and other things in the United States, in which case they have no tariffs.
As the trade between the U.S. and Canada is worth over $900 billion in annual goods and services. Canada is the largest single buyer of U.S. goods, and vice versa. According to the Bank of Canada, a prolonged tariff war will lower Canadian output by nearly 3% over 2 years and wipe out its economic growth. The demand for Canadian goods in the U.S. would suffer, exporters will cut jobs and production, and consumers and businesses will end up spending more. Canada is not the only country retaliating.
We've seen some of these countries retaliate with tariffs of their own. China, for example, retaliated by announcing 15% tariffs on chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton imports from the United States. They also announced a 10% tariff on soybeans, pork, beef, and other various goods. Canada, all to say, look, it's unclear how the markets are going to be impacted by this, but this is coming at a time when already you have a very inflation-weary Americans, many of whom do not want to be thrust into this trade war.
China has also announced 15% tariffs on chicken, corn, wheat, and cotton imports from the USA, and a 10% tariff on sorghum, pork, aquatic products, vegetables, soybeans, beef, fruits, and dairy products. Mexico has also announced that they will place retaliatory tariffs on American imports from Mexico and non-tariff measures. Trump had claimed that only exporters pay for tariffs, but it's actually the businesses receiving the goods that pay for these upfront. These businesses pass on the additional tariff costs to consumers, thereby raising prices. Canada attempts to prevent this by threatening the U.S. with tariffs of its own, but that's not all. Canada threatens to cut U.S. energy supply.
Trump calls her toxic. But there is another top Canadian official now taking Trump on tonight. Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He is calling for his country to use every tool in our toolbox, a direct quote, including cutting off Canadian energy to the United States if Trump follows through with his threat. Warning, quote, the Americans are going to feel the pain as well.
Canada threatened to cut off U.S. energy supply in a shocking move that would change the course of the upcoming trade war. Canada's provinces are prepared to retaliate against the U.S., aside from the 25% tax promised by Trudeau. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, announced that he will cut off America's energy supply. He said he will implement a 25% surcharge on Canadian electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. And then, if the tariffs continued, he will completely cut off these states from Canadian energy supply. This move will affect about 1.5 million Americans.
So, when you talk about that Americans will feel the pain if you have to go through with this, you specifically threatened to turn off the lights to 1.5 million Americans. And I say that just because if you're specifically talking about electricity coming into the U.S. from Canada, that only makes up about 1% of annual U.S. electricity consumption. That's according to the EIA here in the U.S. But, Premier, when it comes to crude oil, if you go bigger, you're looking at Canadian exports to the U.S., 60% of America's total oil imports come from Canada. So do you want to go bigger in this? If these tariffs are going to go through, should you reciprocate with tariffs, not just on electricity, but on crude oil itself?
Well, we ship down 4.3 million barrels every single day. If there was a tariff on that, that would increase gas by $1 a gallon. That wouldn't go over very well. And, both sides of the border are going to feel the pain.
Ontario is the largest economy and most populous province in Canada, and so Ford has the power to wield his own retaliations against the U.S. He has also banned U.S. companies from bidding on Ontario infrastructure projects and canceled a $100 million deal with Starlink, the internet provider from Elon Musk. Ford has urged the lawmakers in Michigan, New York, and Minnesota to either put pressure on Trump to stop placing heavy tariffs on Canada or risk leaving their residents without electricity. He has also urged other Canadian provinces to follow suit.
Prices could shoot up 15 cents a gallon or more at the pump relatively soon, according to a top oil and gas expert.
Everything's going up in price across the board, but I still do think that we're going to see some increase in prices, especially gasoline prices moving forward.
So how high will gas prices go?
You're going to see $3, $4 gasoline price at the pump.
Canada is the largest source of energy imports for the U.S., including crude oil, hydropower, natural gas, and electricity. The surcharge on Canadian electricity will spike domestic energy prices, especially in states in the U.S. Midwest, Great Lakes, and Rocky Mountain. These areas rely on crude oil from Canada, delivered through a pipeline that only travels south from Canada to the U.S. Canada's threat to cut off energy supply to the U.S. will have far-reaching consequences, especially since the network that serves refineries in these areas was specifically made to deliver Canadian crude oil. These pipelines only flow in a single direction, and that's south. To stop reliance on Canada and divert oil from the U.S. like Texas or North Dakota, that would mean years of planning and billions of investments in redirecting the pipelines. What's more,
we get the majority of our crude out of Canada. We produce about 14 million barrels a day in the United States. We still consume 20 million, if not 21 million barrels a day. We need 7 million barrels, and the majority of that comes from Canada.
Impact on U.S.-Canada trade relations. The tit-for-tat tariffs between the U.S. and Canada is expected to spark a trade war that could hurt American and Canadian businesses. But this escalation is expected to affect bilateral trade relations, domestic economies, and the businesses in both nations. The imposition of these tariffs and potential energy supply cuts will strain the historically strong trade relationship between the U.S. and Canada. These tariffs are expected to disrupt integrated supply chains, especially in the energy and automotive sectors, leading to increased costs and challenges for businesses that rely on cross-border trade. Analysts predict that the tariffs could cause Canada to enter into recession, with a potential GDP contraction of up to 5% and major job losses. Even if the U.S. relies on Canada's energy exports, it's still an important component of Canada's economy and will face major risks due to the reliance on the U.S. market. U.S. consumers are facing higher prices too, and the tariffs on Canadian goods take effect. Key U.S. retailers have said that consumers will see price increases almost immediately due to the 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. The energy sector is expected to be among the most impacted, increasing energy prices for American consumers. The escalating measures and countermeasures between the U.S. and Canada could lead to a prolonged trade conflict which would hurt both countries. But Trump does not have any plan to relent, especially since he claims Canada is fueling issues like illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Trump's claims about drugs and tariffs.
U.S. President Donald Trump said on Thursday that his proposed 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods will go into effect on March 4th as scheduled because of what he said were drugs flowing into the U.S. from those countries.
The drugs continue to pour into our country, killing hundreds of thousands of people. We're losing substantially more than 100,000 people. Dead. They're dead. The families are destroyed after that happens.
Trump's executive action against Canada claimed that the country allows too much fentanyl to flow over the border. According to a statement released by the White House after the tariffs took effect, while President Trump gave both Canada and Mexico ample opportunity to curb the dangerous cartel activity and influx of lethal drugs flowing into our country, they have failed to adequately address the situation.
So today, the United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Not when our country and the well-being of everyone in it.
Canadian officials have stated that this is untrue, especially since less than 1% of fentanyl seized by the US comes across the Canadian border. What's more, Canada has been making efforts to reduce the flow of fentanyl, with Trudeau revealing that there was a 97% drop in fentanyl seizures in January compared to December. But the efforts have not been appreciated. At first, Trump threatened to impose these heavy tariffs, except Canada and Mexico made efforts to solve the issues of illegal immigration and drug trafficking. The Canadian government then announced a plan worth 1.3 billion Canadian dollars to increase border security, adding more aerial surveillance through helicopter and drones. The Prime Minister also planned to create a North American Joint Strike Force to tackle the movement of fentanyl across borders and increase the number of personnel available to patrol the border. Trudeau appointed a fentanyl czar and promised to make further measures to crack down on organized crime. Despite this, Trump carried on with his tariffs against Canada at a time when inflation remains stubbornly high. Canada has said that the fentanyl crisis is only a pretext for Trump's new tariffs, especially since they are already working relentlessly to address these security concerns. Trudeau has responded saying that there was no justification for the new U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods.
To agree with the Wall Street Journal. But Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
China's Foreign Ministry spokesman, Lin Jian, has also accused the Trump administration of using fentanyl as an excuse to threaten China, although many of the chemicals used to make fentanyl and other synthetic street drugs have been connected to firms operating in mainland China. Chinese officials have repeatedly said this is a domestic concern that the U.S. should handle itself. Stock markets fall due to U.S. tariffs.
Kelly, let's be specific with what the tariffs are. 25% against all Mexican and Canadian imports, except 10% when it comes to Canadian energy, 10% additional tariffs on Chinese imports. So now let's talk about what the markets did. The Dow down 700, S&P down 100, NASDAQ down almost 500. What's going on?
So if you pull up a chart of the Dow, okay, right around when President Trump started taking questions about tariffs this afternoon, you're going to see this. It went off a cliff. And in fact, we were actually down over 900 points when it comes to the Dow at one point today. So those numbers that you just mentioned, they're definitely extreme, but they aren't as bad as we were. Now, why? Markets have been trying to price in this question of tariffs. And I think what we heard today was President Trump saying, look, this is going to happen at 12:01. A lot of investors, a lot of companies were hoping, is this a negotiation tactic? Are we going to see an 11th hour deal like we saw a month ago, right? This was supposed to go back into effect at the beginning of February. But if you look particularly at the auto sector, Ford, GM, like Stellantis, they were all down significantly, over 2 to 3%, because these are the companies that have big plants in Mexico and Canada, and they're going to feel this as well as some of the retailers the most.
With the concerns that Trump's tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China will lead to a wider trade war, stock markets have fallen in the U.S. Leading stock indexes in the U.S. have been trading lower, while markets in the U.K., Germany, and France all closed down. Stocks fell by nearly 2%, which is the worst day since December. On Tuesday, the S&P 500 dropped 1.2%, earning all gains since Election Day, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 1.6% and the Nasdaq Composite by 0.4%. The tariffs have also increased investor anxiety, with the fears that these could lead to a higher inflation and reduce corporate profits. The tariffs placed on Canada and other countries are expected to have widespread impact, as the U.S. will be hurting itself at the same time. Automotive companies like General Motors and Ford have seen their shares dip by 4% and 2% respectively, while retailers like Best Buy have warned that the tariffs will increase consumer prices, leading to a 13.3% drop in Best Buy's stock. U.S. tariffs spark trade war with China, Mexico, and Canada.
Over the weekend, President Trump declared an economic emergency to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and a 10% tariff on China. The one exception is energy. This includes oil and natural gas from Canada. The tariff on that is going to be 10%. Canada and Mexico have both already said that they're going to retaliate, and China has said that it's going to take any measures necessary to deal with this.
The world woke up on Tuesday with the 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods, and another 10% on Chinese goods. At the same time, Canada's 25% retaliatory tariffs have also come into effect, while China has imposed 10% and 15% tariffs on certain U.S. imports starting from March 10th. Mexico is expected to announce its retaliatory tariffs on March 9th. This is a complicated situation that is affecting the largest trading partners of the world's biggest consumer market. Canada and Mexico have accused the U.S. of violating the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, while China has also spoken strongly against the U.S. for its latest tariffs. The political reactions of these countries have strained the relationships, which is concerning since their economies are highly intertwined. The tit-for-tat tariffs between the U.S. and the other three countries is raising concerns about a prolonged trade war, further straining international relations and global trade. The U.S., Canada, Mexico, and China are deeply interconnected through trade, supply chains, and investment. By imposing tariffs, the U.S. isn't just pressuring these countries, but also disrupting its own economy.
The move is expected to have wide-reaching repercussions, particularly on American companies which rely on overseas factories, now facing a steep increase in the cost of doing business.
Canada threatens to cut off U.S. energy supply, but no one can blame them after Trump's ruthless move to place 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. Will this tariff war come to an end, or will this lead to further decline in the economies of both countries? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.